My name's Katie, and like Harry and Jonathan, who you just heard from, I also undertook a week-long micro-internship with TVERC in December, and I basically got to spend the week analysing butterfly species records. So in this presentation, I will give you a quick whistle-stop tour of what I did and some interesting things that I found out. So, for starters, I was looking at the records of 3 butterfly species, which will hopefully be familiar to some of you who are interested in entomology. And these species were gingy skipper and grizzled skipper, so they're both high priority butterfly species, and wood white, which is a top priority species, and according to records actually has been sighted in Oxford and Berkshire since 2009. So to start with, to visualise the distributions of these butterflies across the region, I generated heat maps. So these were weighted by abundance data. So basically, the bright spots you see on the maps are where there were the most records and the highest number of total butterflies overall that have been recorded. And for these visualisations, I included records of grizzled and gingy skipper from the last 10 years, and for wood white, the records were from 1990 to 2009, as this ensured there were enough records to make the visualisations actually visible and useful. So this first example shows what I found for gingy skipper. So there are some key hotspots for these species, as you can see the different highlighted bits. And then the key hotspot that's highlighted here is Hartslock's Nature Reserve, and that might be a particular stronghold for this species. So then I got a similar result for grizzled skipper, and the most prominent hotspot for this species was Ashton Upthorne. And then finally for wood white, the most prominent place was Whitecross Green Wood Nature Reserve. So I don't know if those areas are familiar to any of you or if you've done any of the surveying in these places. So I then went on to my first analysis, which was identifying sites that had significant threshold populations. So after I'd got this rough idea of the 3 species distributions, I decided to search for sites where there were significant populations of these species recorded. And this is because I was interested in identifying areas that have potential to be classified as local wildlife sites, and a significant population of a high or top priority species being present during a single survey is one way of justifying a site being a local wildlife site. So the threshold for a significant population also varies for each species, so this can be seen on the slide. So for gingy skipper, there needs to be 20 individuals found in a single survey. For grizzled skipper, there needs to be 10 individuals found during a single survey. And then for wood white, because it is so rare and important, presence of that species during a survey is of importance. So then basically for these analyses, I recorded sites with records of these threshold populations of the species that were seen within the last 10 years, and looked at whether the sites would be appropriate for proposing new local wildlife sites based off if they have existing designations and whether the habitats are appropriate for the butterfly species there. So I did this quite manually, so just one example of this. So this is Holy's Down. And just to visualise, this is basically a visualisation of what I did with each important site that I found. So the pink circles here are gingy skipper butterfly recordings, where there are at least 20 individuals during a single survey. And then the orange diamonds are recordings of the species food plant. So here you can see 2 out of the 3 threshold populations that are recorded in this area were actually recorded within Holy's Down SSSI. And this site is adjacent to the Holy's Down Berkshire local wildlife site, but it's not actually covered by it. So there's potential to argue that the local wildlife site could be extended to cover this area. But in this case, because it's a SSSI, that might not actually be a priority. And also the food plant record within the SSSI is actually quite historic, so you might need to do more surveying and things like that. But yeah, this basically just gives an idea of the factors that I looked for, and then if it turned out to be an important site, I included it in my report. And then finally, I completed my main analysis to identify sites where there had been lots of records of butterfly species, but where the threshold population numbers had not previously been reached. So I was interested in this as I thought it might highlight sites where there's been a lot of incidental recordings, but not the formal surveys that tend to generate the records that exceed the threshold populations. So essentially, I aim to identify sites where further more formal surveying has potential to find significant butterfly populations, and this could then make the site eligible for local wildlife site status. So this analysis ended up being quite complicated because I was interested in finding sites where there was sufficient food plants for the species, as well as records for the species. So this slide basically gives a simplified visual idea of what I did during this analysis. So I used a clustering algorithm to first identify where there were clusters of the species food plants. So if you think of that as the green hexagon in the middle, I then looked at the butterfly records of the relevant species that feeds on that food plant and where they were around the food plant cluster. So they're the purple circles. And if there were more than 10 butterfly species nearby, and by nearby to the food plant, I mean within that butterfly dispersal distance, then I classified that site that the food plant cluster was in as a site of interest. And then if butterflies were too far away from the food plant cluster, those were recorded as being associated with it. So basically a distinction of whether that food plant cluster was as important as it looked. And then if there were lots of butterflies recordings associated with the food plant cluster, I investigated that site and looked at it in detail and saw if the habitat was appropriate and whether it already had existing designations quite similar to before. And then I put this together in a couple of documents of candidate sites where butterfly surveys could be undertaken in the future. So this, not very particular attractive slide, just to finish off with, shows the data I collected from the analyses and how I presented it in the final report. And it could be useful for anyone looking to find sites to surveys if you're interested in these species and protecting them. So as you can see, there's the grid reference, so you know where the site is, where there were these food plants and the butterflies associated with them, and then the site name, the site existing designations, whether it is yet classified as a local wildlife site. So if it was already classified, I basically didn't look at it because no need to resurvey if it's already classified as a local wildlife site. And then detail about how many individual species of the butterflies have been found there within the last 10 years. So those numbers ended up being really, really big in some cases, which further convinced me that these sites might be important. They just haven't been recorded to a level that would be a significant population according to the rules. And then I gave some suggested actions on what could be done. And if you look at this one in the middle, it already has designations associated with it, but it's quite an interesting site because there were also records of eggs at this site, which shows it could be a really important site. And then it also supports grizzled skipper, which means it could fulfil the requirement of supporting 2 butterfly species at once, which also means something could be designated as a local wildlife site. But yeah, thank you. Just a very quick whistle-stop tour.